I found the strange pills in my husband's suit pocket. I secretly replaced them with a veterinary-grade dewormer. In the middle of the night, my sister-in-law's screams shattered the silence. My husband roared like a wild animal, and my Everka mother-in-law, witnessing the scene, fainted on the spot. Good evening, and welcome to Midnight Confessions. What would you do if you discovered the husband who once swore eternal love was hiding a devil's concoction in his pocket, while his back had not been yours for months? And would you have the courage to gamble your entire life on one insane venture, turning that sinful pill into a weapon of mass destruction, so that in the dead of night, a heart-wrenching scream and a beastly roar would rip away every mask, exposing a truth more hideous than hell itself? Tonight, I placed my greedy bet, and I didn't know what lay ahead, victory or oblivion. My name is Clara. I am 30 years old, and for 6 years, I have been a daughter-in-law in the Williamson family. 6 years is a long time, enough to transform a naive girl who believed in fairy tale love into a quiet woman, a mere shadow in her own home. From the outside, everyone said I was lucky. Lucky to be married to Brian, a successful director of sales with an elegant demeanor and a silver tongue. Lucky to live in a sprawling 3-story house in an affluent suburban neighborhood without a single financial worry. But they didn't know the price I paid for this luck. The price of profound humiliation and loneliness. My new family, besides my treacherous husband and my cynical mother-in-law, Eleanor, also included my husband's younger brother, David, and his family. David was a good, honest man, but his job as a construction manager required him to travel constantly and often work the night shift. His absence created a deadly void, a golden opportunity for his wife, Jessica, and his brother, Brian, to sow their sins. Jessica, my sister-in-law, was a beautiful woman, but her beauty was inseparable from her flirtatious and brazen nature. She always looked down on me, seeing me as a simple small-town girl, and never hesitated to use her looks to seduce my own husband. But the most guilty party was, of course, Brian. Over the last 6 months, he had completely changed. From a loving and attentive husband, he had become a savant, cold, irritable tyrant. Our married life had come to a complete standstill. He moved into his study at the end of the hall, claiming he needed quiet to work on an important project. I believed him. I gritted my teeth and endured, convincing myself he was doing this for his career. I still served him, bringing him meals and drinks, tending to him as a queen would her king. While I withered in my loneliness, Jessica seemed to shine brighter every day. She shamelessly spent money on new designer clothes and luxury items that were clearly beyond what David's salary could afford. Their inappropriate closeness became increasingly obvious. Accidental touches, meaningful glances, whispers in the night when David wasn't home. All of it felt like needles piercing my heart, making it bleed. Suspicion grew into a monster that devoured my soul, turning me into a paranoid insomniac. And this afternoon, that monster was finally fed its fill of the naked truth. Brian came home from a client meeting, hurriedly showered, and locked himself back in his study, tossing his suit jacket over the back of a chair. As I always did, I picked it up to take to the dry cleaners. I slipped my hand into the inner pocket, and my heart stopped. I pulled out a small foil blister pack. The black packaging bore a single name in English: King Power. Inside the blister was a single, bright blue capsule. I was no child. I knew what it was: a powerful, male enhancement pill. One painful, humiliating question drilled into my brain. What for? Why would my husband need this when he hadn't touched me in 6 months? Who was he buying it for? The answer was as clear as day, bitter and cruel. Jessica. Tonight, David was on the night shift again. My husband had already made an excuse to work late. This pill was his preparation for a night of forbidden pleasure with his own brother's wife. They were going to turn this house, the very place where his mother and I slept, into their personal brothel. A wave of rage and disgust washed over me. I wanted to break down their doors, throw this blister pack in their faces, and shatter this fake family. But reason held me back. If I did that, they would deny everything. My mother-in-law would defend her precious son and her favorite daughter-in-law. And in the end, I would be the one to blame. I couldn't accept such a crushing defeat. 6 years of my youth could not end in such disgrace. I clutched the blister pack tightly. A wild, cruel plan ignited in my mind. I wouldn't expose them. I would turn their weapon into their own instrument of destruction. I remembered that in our first aid kit, there was a veterinary dewormer for livestock that my father had given me last week for the guard dogs at our family cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. My father had warned me that the medicine was extremely potent and that an incorrect dose could cause seizures, foaming at the mouth, and severe neurological distress. This was a game of death. I locked myself in my room. My hands trembled as I carefully opened the King Power capsule with a small utility knife. I wrapped the blue powder in a piece of paper and hid it away. Then, I crushed one of the dewormer tablets, took its beige-colored powder, and filled the empty blue capsule. I sealed it back perfectly. I had created a monster, a pill that looked like heavenly pleasure but contained a living hell. I placed the swapped capsule back into its blister and returned it to my husband's jacket pocket as if nothing had happened. Done. I collapsed onto the bed, drenched in a cold sweat. I was terrified, but deep down, I felt a savage satisfaction. A taste of the savage satisfaction. Revenge. Night fell. Dinner passed in a suffocating silence. After David rushed off to work, Brian also went straight to his study, not forgetting to tell me to go to bed early. I lay in my cold bed, my eyes wide open. I waited for the Kate signal that would mark the beginning of my gamble. Just past midnight, I heard Brian's study door open softly. Then, the sound of tiptoeing footsteps heading towards Jessica's room. Her door opened and closed. My heart stopped. They had begun. Time crawled by, agonizingly slow. Suddenly, a wild, inhuman scream pierced the night's silence. It came from Jessica's room. Before I could process it, another sound erupted, the roar of a wounded animal. From the same place. It was Brian's voice. My husband. Jessica's scream and Brian's roar were like two hammer blows, shattering the quiet of the house. I leaped out of bed, my heart pounding. My gamble had paid off, but the result was far more horrifying than I could have imagined. My mother-in-law's door flew open. Eleanor ran out into the hallway, her elderly face pale with horror, her messy hair sticking out in all directions. She stammered about what was happening. What was that noise? Maybe it was a burglar. Her eyes darting around in fear. I didn't answer, only pointing towards the room of sin. From inside, the inhuman sounds continued. Jessica's screams had now turned into choked sobs mixed with terror. She cried for help, for the monster to get away from her. Brian's roars grew louder, more frantic. There were also dull thuds, as if someone was slamming their body against the walls. Eleanor and I looked at each other. In both our eyes was an unspeakable fear. She called out their names, Brian and Jessica, asking what was wrong with them, her voice trembling. As she staggered towards their door, she pulled on the handle, but it was locked. From the inside, we heard Jessica's weak, desperate voice, begging for help. Eleanor shrieked that we had to break down the door immediately. Her voice cracked. She turned to me, her eyes wild, ordering me not to just stand there like a statue, to find an axe. Like a robot, I ran to the garage and found a heavy sledgehammer. When I returned, Eleanor was futilely trying to shoulder the thick wooden door open. The strength of an old woman was no match for it. I handed her the sledgehammer. She snatched it from me, her eyes bloodshot, and began to swing wildly at the lock. The clang of metal on metal was deafening, but even that couldn't drown out the terrifying sounds from within. After a dozen blows, the lock finally gave way. The door swung open, and a blast of hot, stuffy air with a sickening odor hit us. And then we saw it. A scene that neither I nor Eleanor would ever be able to forget for the rest of our lives. This was no ordinary scene of infidelity. This was a living painting of hell on earth. The entire room was in shambles, as if a hurricane had torn through it. Blankets and pillows were strewn across the floor. A bedside lamp was shattered, sharp shards of glass scattered everywhere. And in the middle of the room lay Brian, my elegant and respectable husband, completely naked. But that wasn't the worst of it. His entire body was a purplish red, like a boiled crab. His skin was covered in bloody scratches that he had apparently inflicted upon himself. White foam trickled from his mouth, and his eyes were rolled back in their sockets. There was no trace of human reason left in them. He was convulsing on the floor, his hands clawing at his own body, and from his throat came a guttural, animalistic growl. This was no longer Brian. This was a dying beast. In the corner of the room, behind the vanity table, Jessica was huddled in terror. She was also half naked, her long hair tangled, and her beautiful face a fawn mask of pure horror. She clutched her trembling body and stared with wide, insane eyes at the writhing monster on the floor. Seeing the door open, she crawled towards us like a drowning person reaching for a straw, her sobs now silent. She pleaded for help, saying he had gone crazy. Eleanor froze in the doorway. Her pale face turned a deathly white, then bluish. Her lips trembled. She tried to say something, but no words came out. She stared at her beloved son, who had turned into an animal. Then at her younger daughter-in-law, in such a shameful and degraded state. These two images, two naked and disgusting truths, delivered a blow too powerful for her consciousness, a mind that had always prided itself on family dignity and reputation. She opened her mouth, her eyes bulged, and with a soft groan, she crumpled to the floor, unconscious. I instinctively rushed towards her, shouting for my mother-in-law, but it was too late. She had fainted right on the threshold of that sinful room. Everything happened too fast, too horribly. The screams, the crashes, and the crying had awakened the entire street. I could hear whispers and footsteps near our front gate. A few curious neighbors were already running towards the house. They stood at the entrance, gaping at the chaos inside. I knew then that my family's time charade, the glittering facade Eleanor had painstakingly built for years, had been shattered into a million pieces tonight. I was panicking, but beneath the panic was an ice-cold calm. What to do next? I couldn't let it all end here. My game had just begun. I had to control it. I had to play the part of the shocked wife and daughter-in-law. With a trembling hand, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. My voice broke as I sobbed into the phone, telling the operator there had been a terrible accident at our house, pleading for an ambulance to come quickly. I dictated the address between gasps. My performance had just begun, and the curtain that hid this family's rottenness was about to be torn down by my own hands. The wail of ambulance sirens ripped through the night. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the curious faces of the neighbors, who were now crowded in front of our gate. The gate was unlocked, the kind neighbors who had arrived first had opened it wide. They stood there, whispering and pointing. Every glance, every murmur, felt like 1,000 needles piercing what my husband's family called their honor. The paramedics, their faces professional but unable to hide their shock, quickly pushed stretchers inside. Playing the part of the distraught wife, I bustled beside them, my eyes swollen and my voice cracking, showing them the way. I told them my husband and mother-in-law were upstairs and to please save them. I played my role so convincingly that I surprised myself. I grabbed a nurse's arm and whispered tremulously that I didn't know what happened to my husband, that he just went berserk, destroying everything and clawing at himself, and that my mother-in-law had fainted from the shock. The nurse patted my hand reassuringly, telling me to stay calm and that they would do their best. The scene in the bedroom replayed itself before more eyes. The paramedics were momentarily stunned, but they quickly recovered and divided their tasks. Two of them handled Brian. He had stopped convulsing as violently, but was still growling, his eyes vacant, his body still naked. They had to inject him with a sedative and struggle to get him onto the stretcher, covering him haphazardly with a thin blanket. Two other paramedics administered first aid to Eleanor, checking her blood pressure and pulse before quickly moving her onto another stretcher. Jessica was still huddled in the corner, crying silently. A female nurse approached her, draped my robe over her shoulders, and helped her out. The nurse asked if she was hurt and needed to be examined. Jessica just shook her head, her face listless and apathetic. She didn't dare lift her eyes. Her usual arrogant, flirtatious demeanor was gone, leaving only shame and humiliation. And then the most humiliating parade of all began. First, they brought out Brian's stretcher. Under the glare of streetlights and the flash of neighbors' cell phone cameras, the image of the respectable director of sales, Brian Williamson, was displayed in its most pathetic form. The thin blanket couldn't hide his scratched body, Foam still lingered on his face, and his gaze was wild. Even after the sedative. The whispers from the crowd grew louder. People recognized him, wondering what was wrong, speculating that he had a psychotic break or was high on drugs. They questioned why he was in his sister-in-law's room in the middle of the night. Next, they brought out Eleanor's stretcher. The retired principal, who was always lecturing others on morality and family values, now lay motionless, her old face ashen. The fact that she had collapsed right at the scene made the story even more juicy and dramatic. Finally, led by a nurse, Jessica emerged. She was wearing my oversized robe, her head bowed low, hiding her tear-streaked face with her hair. But everyone recognized her. The beautiful, fashionable sister-in-law now looked like a criminal being led to the gallows. The gossip mill churned again. People identified her as David's wife, wondering what she was doing in a room with his brother, dressed like that. They pitied David, who always worked nights, concluding she must have been cheating, and that's why a fight broke out. Rumors and speculation began to spread like wildfire. I stood there, watching the three esteemed members of this family being loaded one by one into the liveris ambulance, under the stares and whispers of the entire street. I was crying. Tears of bitter satisfaction streamed down my cheeks. My first net had been cast. Honor, reputation, the things they valued more than life itself, were now torn and trampled by my own hands. But this was just the beginning. The main act awaited at the hospital, where the truth would be proven by science. I told a close neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, to please keep an eye on the house as I had to go with them. Then I climbed into the ambulance, sitting in the darkest corner where no one would notice me. The vehicle, its sirens blaring, sped away, leaving behind a trail of curious stares and a scandalous story that would be the talk of the town for a very long time. I wiped my tears, but the corner of Juskend. My mouth twitched into a cold smile. Everything was going according to my plan. The second net, the net of medical truth and cunning justification, was about to be cast, and I would be the most patient fisherman, waiting for my prey to swim right into the trap. The atmosphere in the emergency room was suffocating and tense. The sharp smell of antiseptic stung my nose, mixed with the beeping of medical equipment and the 70s hurried footsteps of doctors and nurses. Brian was placed in a special observation room. Eleanor was moved to the ICU. Jessica, after a brief examination confirmed no serious injuries, sat hunched over on a bench in the Macker hallway, her face still a mask of shock. As the only lucid relative, I busied myself with paperwork and making the deposit. I deliberately projected an NSO image of panic and frantic activity to everyone. Several nurses looked at me with sympathy, likely having heard a version of the story from the ambulance crew. I just kept my head down, playing the perfect role of a poor wife suddenly struck by tragedy. After nearly 2 agonizing hours, a senior doctor, likely the head of the ER, came out. He called for me, his face serious. He asked if I was the family of .com. The patient Brian Williamson. I confirmed I was his wife, and asked anxiously how he was. The doctor adjusted his glasses and looked at me intently. He explained that the patient's condition was temporarily stable after they administered a sedative and performed a gastric lavage. However, he continued, the lab analysis showed something highly unusual. He paused, as if giving me time to prepare. The lab results, he stated, had found traces of fenbendazole in the patient's blood and stomach contents. He explained that it was the active ingredient in a dewormer for livestock and was absolutely not for human consumption. In high doses, the substance could cause severe poisoning, triggering powerful hallucinations, overstimulating the nervous system to the point of seizures, and causing acute digestive distress. He told me I was lucky Brian was brought in when he was, or the consequences could have been fatal. Every word from the doctor was like a clear, irrefutable verdict. This was what I had been waiting for. A medical conclusion that could not be denied. I feigned shock, covering my mouth with my hand, my eyes welling with tears. I cried out about animal medicine, how it was impossible, that we didn't have anything like that in our house, that there must be a mistake. I played the part of the disbelieving wife to perfection. The doctor sighed and patted my shoulder. He said they could only draw conclusions based on the lab results and suggested that my family might want to report this to the police for an investigation. 4. Now, the patient needed to be observed for a few more days. He then informed me that my mother-in-law had just regained consciousness. I thanked the doctor and staggered towards the ICU. I knew this information would quickly reach Eleanor's ears, and I wanted to see how that woman, who always placed reputation above all else, would squirm. Just as I expected, when I entered, Eleanor was awake. She lay in the hospital bed, still pale, but her eyes held their usual cold glint. Jessica sat beside her, crying, recounting the doctor's findings. Hearing it, Eleanor showed no shock or panic. Instead, she stared at me sharply, as if trying to burn a hole through me with her gaze. She hissed that this was my doing. Though her breath was weak, her accusation was clear. I gasped and took a step back with an offended expression, asking what she was talking about. I said I had just come from the doctor myself and was terrified. Eleanor hissed again, telling me not to pretend. She asked who else in the house would want to poison Brian with such a disgusting substance. At that moment, Jessica suddenly spoke up. Her tone was tearful but calculating. She suggested to Eleanor that perhaps Brian was sleepwalking. Maybe he had accidentally wandered into her room, and, in his sleep, drank something he shouldn't have. I smiled inwardly. The scenario was so far-fetched it was laughable. But in this situation, it was the only life raft they could grasp. Eleanor seemed to have a revelation, her eyes lighting up. She agreed. Sleepwalking. She claimed her Brian sometimes did that. He must have been sleepwalking and drunk something strange, maybe the rat poison she had just bought and put in the corner of the kitchen. She dismissed the idea of animal medicine as nonsense. She said it with such conviction, as if it were the absolute truth. She was trying to spin the story in a less embarrassing direction. Sleepwalking and rat poisoning still sounded better than an ad. Affair with a sister-in-law and poisoning from a performance-enhancing drug. Jessica immediately picked up the thread. She claimed she was asleep when she suddenly felt someone enter her room. She thought it was David coming home early from work, but it turned out to be Brian, who then attacked her. She was terrified, and that's why she screamed. She cried so pitifully, trying to craft an image of an unfortunate victim attacked by a sleepwalking brother-in-law. Just then, Brian was moved from the ER to a regular ward. He was conscious but still very weak. Hearing the charade played by his mother and sister-in-law, no matter how foolish he was, he understood what he had to do. He mumbled that he didn't remember anything, that his head was just throbbing. He agreed that he must have been sleepwalking. The three of them, mother and children, united to create a perfect performance, a cunning justification to cover their sins. They looked at me with a gaze that held both a plea and a threat, forcing me to accept this absurd story. They thought I was still the old, foolish, and pliable Clara. They were wrong. I looked at them. Tears still streamed down my cheeks, but inside, I felt only boundless contempt. I asked innocently about the sleepwalking, but then pointed out that the doctor said it was dewormer for dogs and cats, and we didn't have any pets. My simple question pierced the biggest hole in their scenario. Eleanor fell silent, her face twitching, but she was an old fox. She suggested that maybe a rat from the neighbor's yard brought it in. She insisted the matter shouldn't be blown out of proportion. They would tell the doctor he was sleepwalking and drank the wrong thing, and then request he be discharged immediately. If the police got involved, it would be a huge disgrace. She ended with a commanding tone, giving no one a chance to argue. I fell silent, lowering my head, pretending to agree. But inside me, a storm was raging. Fine, if you want to play, I will watch your show. But this drama will not have the simple ending you expect. Because the main audience, the one person with the ultimate right to judge, would soon appear. And I was curious how you would act when faced with the fury of a man cuckolded by his own brother and wife. The storm I was waiting for came sooner than I expected. David, after receiving a brief call from me that the whole family was in the hospital, raced back from his out-of-town project site. He burst into the hospital like a hurricane, his usually kind and simple face now filled with anxiety and fear. He grabbed my shoulders, asking frantically what had happened, who was hurt. With my eyes swollen from crying, I just shook my head, my voice choked. I told him to just Go inside, that Eleanor, Brian, and Jessica were all in there. My unfinished words were like a slow-acting poison seeping into David's mind. He asked no more questions and pushed the door open. When David entered, a scene of a harmonious family recovering from a mishap was being staged. Eleanor sat on the bed while Jessica spoon-fed her some broth. Brian lay on the adjacent bed with a listless expression. Seeing David, all three of them flinched, their faces awkward. Eleanor stammered, asking why he was there at this hour. David looked from one to another, demanding to know what happened, his gaze finally resting on Jessica, who was wearing my robe. A faint suspicion began to dawn in his eyes. Eleanor quickly launched into the agreed-upon story. She claimed it was just a small incident, that Brian's old sleepwalking problem had flared up. He had wandered the house and accidentally drank some rat poison. Jessica saw him, got scared and screamed, and the shock caused her to faint. She said thank God they were brought to the hospital quickly, and were all fine now. She told the story smoothly, trying to seem calm. David frowned, questioning the sleepwalking and rat poison story. He said he had never heard of Brian having such a condition. He looked at his brother, who kept his head down, not daring to meet his eyes. Brian mumbled an affirmation, his voice barely audible. He claimed not to remember much, but that it was probably true. Brian's hesitation only strengthened David's suspicion. He turned to his wife and demanded she tell him exactly what happened. Jessica trembled, her eyes filling with tears again. She repeated, word for word, what Eleanor had coached her to say. She was sleeping, saw Brian in her room, and he suddenly collapsed and started convulsing. She was terrified and screamed, knowing nothing else. Their story, though rehearsed, had too many tool holes. David was an engineer. His mind was logical and clear. He wasn't easily convinced by such a ridiculous tale. He cut her off. If Brian drank poison and had a seizure, he asked, why were neither of you wearing any clothes? David's question was a knife to the heart of all three. The air in the room froze. Eleanor, Brian, and Jessica turned deathly pale. No one could speak. At that moment, I entered the room. I knew it was time to launch my first attack. I approached David, patted his shoulder gently, and said in a sympathetic tone that he should calm down, that they had all been through a great deal of stress. I told him not to interrogate them like that, or his mother might get sick. Again, my words sounded calming, but they indirectly confirmed that their story was a lie. Then, I turned to Jessica and handed her a bag of clothes. I told her I had gone home and brought her a change of clothes so she could be more comfortable, as my robe was probably too big for her. This sentence was another needle pricking at David's sensitivity. Why was his wife wearing her sister-in-law's clothes? Under what circumstances had they been last night? Seeing David still standing there, lost in thought, I decided to pour gasoline on the fire. I looked at Brian and asked with an innocent tone if he was feeling better. I remarked how strange it was that the doctor said he was poisoned by dog and cat medicine, but his mother said it was rat poison. I feigned confusion, suggesting the lab must have made a mistake, and told him to rest and get well soon. I stressed the words dog and cat medicine. Those words pierced David's ears. The strangeness of the situation piqued. Where did veterinary medicine come from in their house, and why would his brother take it in his wife's room in the middle of the night? David could no longer contain himself. He spun around, grabbed Jessica by the shoulders, and growled. He demanded the truth, accusing them of having an affair behind his back. He yelled, asking why Brian was in her room in the middle of the night and why they were both naked. Jessica shrieked in fear, denying everything and telling him not to accuse her. Seeing the situation spiraling out of control, Eleanor shouted at David, calling him crazy for daring to suspect his own brother. She reiterated that it was an accident and questioned his trust in his mother, brother, and wife. She tried to use her maternal authority to pressure him, but he was no longer a dutiful son. Suspicion and jealousy had turned him into someone else. He told his mother not to defend them, that something was wrong, and that he would find out the truth. I stood in the corner, silently watching this family drama reach its climax. A cold smile returned to my lips. Everything was going better than I had hoped. I didn't have to do much. Just a few hints, a few gentle prods, and the smoldering Embers of suspicion in David's soul had flared into a raging fire. And I knew. That fire could not be extinguished. It would burn until it had consumed all of Dashan, this family's lies. And now, it was time for me to return to the scene of crime, to retrieve the final piece of evidence. The evidence that would end this entire story. While David was raging at the hospital, I used the excuse of needing to make soup and bring things for everyone to go home. This was my golden opportunity to retrieve my ultimate prize, the weapon that would decide the final outcome of this war. The house felt eerily quiet. There were no haughty commands from my mother-in-law, no flirtatious glances from my sister-in-law, no presence of a treacherous husband. I walked through my own home feeling like an intruder. But, this time, I was intruding to reclaim my justice. I went up to the second floor. I didn't head to my bedroom or Brian's study. My destination was the family room. There stood a set of expensive leather sofas that my mother-in-law was always so proud of. It was where she usually sat like a queen, judging and lecturing me. But she never knew that in the most respectable and open place in the house, the most filthy and disgusting things were happening. About a month ago, when Brian's coldness and Jessica's flirtatiousness became unbearable, extreme anxiety forced me to act. I could no longer live in uncertainty and suspicion. I needed proof. After days of sleepless nights, I made a bold decision. I ordered a tiny spy camera online, disguised as a coat hook. I told everyone I bought it for the guest bathroom, but I secretly installed it in the most unexpected place. At the very top of the mahogany display cabinet, aimed directly at the sofa. The camera watched over the entire family room. I checked the footage for a few weeks, but only saw normal life. I even started to think I was going crazy with suspicion, but a woman's intuition wouldn't let me give up. And today, I knew my intuition was right. I got a chair, climbed up, and carefully removed the camera. My heart pounded. I was afraid to face the truth, yet I desperately wanted to see it. I took the Mistress camera to my bedroom and locked the door. I connected it to my laptop. On the 7:7 screen, dozens of video files appeared, sorted by date. I skipped the last few days. I knew they wouldn't have done anything in the family room recently. I went back 2 weeks, to a Saturday. I remembered that day, my mother-in-law and I had gone to the cabin, and David was on a sudden business trip. Only Brian and Jessica were home. Brian said he had a lot of work to do, and Jessica complained of being tired. Now I understood how perfect that coincidence was. With a trembling hand, I pressed play. The screen lit up. At first, an empty family room. About 10 minutes later, Jessica appeared. She was wearing a short, fiery red silk nightgown, almost transparent. She got a bottle of water from the reacher. TN, almost transparent. Mini fridge, sat on the sofa, and struck the most seductive pose imaginable. A few minutes later, Brian came out of his study. Seeing Jessica, his gaze darkened with lust. He said nothing, just walked over and sat beside her. And then, before my eyes, a scene unfolded that I had only dared to imagine in my worst nightmares, but now saw in the smallest, most graphic detail. They fell upon each other like moths to a flame. Kisses, caresses, moans, and filthy words I never thought would come from my educated husband's mouth filled the room. They had no shame, no guilt. They made love right there on the sofa where the entire family sat every day, in the room my mother-in-law proudly called a tasco. Reflection of the family's dignity. Tears streamed from my eyes, not of heartbreak, but of pure rage. I stared at the man in the video. Was that Brian, the husband I had loved for 6 years? No. That was a demon in human form. I stared at the woman in the video. Was that Jessica, the sister-in-law I tried to tolerate? No. That was a shameless, lustful viper. Gritting my teeth, I watched the entire 1-hour video to the end. I didn't miss a single detail. I wanted to burn this betrayal into my memory forever. Then, calmly, I copied the video to a flash drive and made another copy in my cloud storage. Done. I erased all data from the camera and returned it to its place. No traces. The irrefutable proof was in my hands. The moment I revealed it, the lives of those 2 pieces of trash would be crushed to dust. Brian's reputation, Jessica's false innocence, and Eleanor's hollow family values, all of it would go up in flames. But I wasn't going to do it now. A single video of an affair wasn't enough. It only proved their immorality. I wanted more. I wanted them to pay not just with their reputation, but financially. I wanted them to have nothing to live in misery and poverty. I wanted to expose not just their betrayal, but the greed and selfishness that ran deep in this family. And for that, I needed one more piece of evidence. Evidence related to money. I knew where to find it. Hatred had turned me into a completely different person, cold, calculating, and merciless. Clara, the naive lamb, was dead. All that remained was a she-wolf, ready to tear her prey to shreds. After securing the flash drive containing the deadly truth, I didn't hurry back to the hospital. I knew the show there was still ongoing, and my absence would only add to their anxiety. They would wonder what I was plotting. I needed time, precious time, to take the next step in my revenge. My target now was Brian's study, a place I was never allowed to enter without permission. But today, nothing could stop me. The study was simple yet classy. A large wooden desk, an expensive leather chair, bookshelves filled with books on economics and management. It all created the image of an intellectual and a successful man. But to me now, it was just a hollow shell hiding a rotten, depraved soul. I sat in his chair and opened his laptop. Thankfully, he had a habit of not using a password. I quickly opened the browser history. Nothing. Unusual economic news, stock market reports. He was smart enough to erase any incriminating tracks. But he didn't know that wasn't what I was looking for. I opened the personal finance app, where I knew he kept all his bank account information. Brian and I had a joint savings account in both our names. It was money I had saved over 6 years from my salary as an accountant and part of what Brian had contributed. That money was meant for our future children. It was my sweat, my tears, my future. I logged into the mobile banking app. When the salary numbers appeared on the screen, my heart felt like it was being squeezed by an invisible hand. The account balance was less than $100. Nearly $80,000, our entire savings, was gone. I felt dizzy. I grabbed the edge of the desk to keep from falling. With a trembling hand, I clicked on the transaction history, and the bitter truth was laid bare in its unforgiving clarity. Over the past 6 months, exactly since he started being cold to me, a series of withdrawals and transfers had been made. Large sums, $5,000, $10,000, were regularly transferred to an EPA 6 account whose recipient was none other than Jessica. Furthermore, there were large payments to a car dealership and several well-known jewelry stores. I remembered the new SUV Jessica had been showing off, which she claimed was a Prolisis gift from David. I remembered the diamond necklace she wore at a family event, which she said was a birthday present from her husband. It was all a lie. David, with his salary as a construction manager, could never have afforded such expensive gifts. The person lavishing money on that degenerate sister-in-law was my husband, Brian. He had used my savings, my sweat and tears, to finance his affair, to buy pleasure for his own brother's wife. This betrayal was more painful and humiliating than the physical affair. He hadn't just defiled our marriage. He had coldly robbed me of my future, making a complete fool of me. My mind was no longer just a river of ice. It had become an eternal glacier, cold and sharp. All the love, all the hope, all the last threads that tied me to this man had been severed. I no longer cried. Tears were a luxury I could not afford. I only felt a deep, burning hatred and a desire for revenge, stronger than ever before. Calmly, I photographed every transaction history, every amount, every date, every recipient's name. I saved it all on the same damn flash drive, right next to their filthy video. Now I had 2 weapons of mass destruction in my hands. One to prove their moral bankruptcy, the other to prove their ethical depravity. But I didn't stop there. I kept searching. I found a file named Investment Plan. But inside were not stock quotes, but a detailed plan designed by Brian. He planned to use the remaining money and take out a mortgage on our house to open a high-end fashion boutique for Jessica. And the manager, of course, would be Jessica. He was building a bright future for them, a future built on my suffering and David's. I closed the laptop. A pale smile touched my lips. Thank you, Brian. Thank you for showing me your true face. You are not just an adulterer. You are a thief. A thief who embezzled joint assets. A thief who deceived his wife and his own brother. I stood up and walked out of that study. Before leaving, I made sure to erase all traces of my visit. I made some soup, poured it into a thermos, and calmly returned to the hospital. I knew that upon my return, a new performance awaited me. A hypocritical family meeting where the criminals would play the victims, and I, the real victim, would have to continue playing the role of the docile sheep. Very well, I would play along. I would play until the very end, until a moment I could finally turn this rotten stage upside down. When I returned to the hospital, thermos in hand, Brian had already been discharged. The doctor said there was no longer a threat to his life, he just needed to rest at home under supervision. Most likely, Eleanor had used her old connections to get her precious son out of that scandalous place as quickly as possible. The house greeted me with a suffocating silence. Eleanor sat on the sofa, her face still pale, but her gaze had already regained its usual commanding air. Brian sat next to her, his head bowed, not daring to look at anyone. Jessica, now in more modest clothing, sat in a far corner, occasionally dabbing at her eyes. David sat opposite them, his face hard and cold. He had spent the entire time with his family at the hospital, and I knew their explanations had not convinced him. Seeing me, Eleanor cleared her throat, breaking the silence. She told me to put down the thermos and sit, that she wanted to talk. Her voice was calm, as if nothing terrible had happened. I obediently followed her command. I sat next to David, facing my husband and his mistress. The family meeting, full of lies and hypocrisy, officially began. Eleanor started her speech. She acknowledged that the previous night's events were a huge shock to everyone, but she quoted a proverb about not airing dirty laundry in public. This was about the honor of the entire family, the Williamson name. She paused, looking at everyone, especially David, whose reaction had been the sharpest. She said she had spoken with Brian and Jessica and that it was all an accident, a regrettable misunderstanding. She claimed that her older son was overworked and exhausted, and his old sleepwalking problem had returned. That's why he accidentally went into Jessica's room. In his sleep, he was thirsty and saw a glass of water on the table that Jessica had prepared for herself. He thought it was water and drank it. It turned out Jessica had added sleeping pills to it to help her sleep better. The two medications had a bad reaction, and that's what happened to Brian. I almost burst out laughing. The new scenario was more plausible and scientific than the rat poison story. She was good at improvising. But she didn't know that the more detailed the scenario, the more holes it had. She continued, explaining that when Brian started convulsing, he thrashed about violently. Jessica panicked and tried to restrain him, which is why they were pushing and shoving each other, and their clothes got messed up. That was all. There was absolutely nothing else to it. Finished, she gestured to Brian and Jessica. As if rehearsed, Brian lifted his head and looked at David with a guilty expression. He apologized to his brother, taking all the blame for the misunderstanding he caused. He swore there was nothing between him and Jessica. Jessica then began her part of the show. She knelt before David, tears streaming down her face. She begged him to believe her, that there was nothing between her and Brian. She claimed to be a victim as well, and swore that if she had done anything behind his back, she would be punished by God. She cried and swore so tragically that any unknowing man might have been moved. But David was no fool. He looked at his kneeling wife, then at his downcast brother. He was silent for a long time before saying in a cold, sharp voice, asking Jessica since when she had insomnia so bad, she needed sleeping pills. He had never seen her take them. Jessica stammered, claiming it had only been for the last few days and she hadn't wanted to worry him. David gave a cynical smile. He then brought up the doctor's findings, that Brian had been poisoned by veterinary medicine, not sleeping pills, and asked how they explained that. Eleanor immediately interjected, blaming the hospital for a mistaken analysis. She said she would handle it and told David not to believe those stupid papers. David snapped back, asking his mother if she thought he was a 3-year-old. How could a major hospital make such a mistake in a serious case? The atmosphere grew tense again. Seeing that David couldn't be convinced by logic, Eleanor switched to emotional pressure. She acknowledged his anger but reminded him that Brian was his own brother. She asked if he had the heart to destroy him. If this got out, he would lose his career and reputation, and their family would be disgraced. She begged him, for the sake of the family, to forget the matter. She forbade anyone from ever discussing it again, declaring it an order from his mother. She was playing her last card. Her maternal authority. I sat silently, not saying a word, just observing. I saw the turmoil in David's eyes. He was angry, he was suspicious, but he was also bound by a sense of duty, by so-called brotherhood. He was torn. I knew it was time for me to intervene, not to expose, but to temporarily extinguish the fire. I stood up, approached David, and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. I said I thought his mother was right, that a bad peace was better than a good quarrel. Brian had realized his mistake, and I thought they should give him a chance. After all, they were brothers. My words shocked everyone. They probably didn't expect me, the betrayed party, to be so magnanimous. David looked at me with a complicated expression. Eleanor, Brian, and Jessica stared at me with surprise that slowly turned into relief. They thought I had surrendered. That my weakness and love for my husband had led me to choose forbearance. I held back a cynical smile. How wrong you are. I wasn't being generous. I was just giving you a little more time to enjoy this false peace. The higher you climb, the harder you will fall. The more you believe in your safety, the more unexpected and deadly the final attack will be. I needed a bigger stage, with a bigger audience, to bring down the final curtain on this drama. And that stage was fast approaching. Eleanor's birthday. The day all their relatives and friends would gather. That would be my judgment day. A week after that hypocritical family meeting, a strange, manufactured tranquility settled over the house. Everyone tried to act as if nothing had happened. Eleanor stopped making snide remarks at me. Jessica avoided me, hiding like a mouse from a cat. Brian, on the contrary, showed excessive remorse and attentiveness. He bought me flowers and gifts, spoke sweet words, trying to give in sweet words atone for his sins. He thought I had truly forgiven everything, that I was still the same fool who was easy to manipulate. I accepted all his false affection with a gentle smile, but inside, I felt only disgust. David remained moody and withdrawn. He stopped asking questions, but I knew the fire of suspicion in his heart had not been extinguished. It was only temporarily suppressed, waiting for a spark to flare up and burn everything down. And I would be that spark. Eleanor's 65th birthday was approaching. It was a major event for the Williamson family, always celebrated with a grand party at home. Every year, all relatives and close friends would gather. It was Eleanor's chance to show off her status, her 2 successful sons, and her 2 virtuous daughters-in-law. This year was no exception. Eleanor assigned me and Jessica the task of preparing everything perfectly, from the party food to the house decorations. She specifically told me to prepare a short video of photos from her life, to be played when everyone had gathered so they could reminisce about the good times. She had no idea that her request had given me the perfect opportunity, the ideal stage for the final act of my drama. I gladly agreed, assuring her I would prepare the best tribute. I spent the entire day in front of the computer, but not looking for old photos. I was editing my precious video footage. I skillfully spliced together the video of their sordid affair with the bank transaction history. I added clear captions. A gift from brother-in-law, Brian, to sister-in-law Jessica. Memories of a secret trip for 2. For the finale, I displayed an image of the King Power package, side by side with the veterinary dewormer, with large text slowly appearing. And this is the price of betrayal. I had created a masterpiece of revenge, a time bomb waiting for its moment. On the day of the birthday, the house was filled with guests, uncles, aunts, cousins, all were present. Everyone was laughing and chatting, unaware they were about to witness a drama more thrilling than any soap opera. The party was in full swing. After some speeches and well wishes, everyone began to eat and drink. This was my moment. I stood up, took the microphone, and spoke in a clear, slightly trembling voice, addressing the honored guests and family. I announced that today was a special day for our mother and that on behalf of the family, I wanted to present a short video so we could all remember the brightest and warmest moments of her life. Everyone applauded. Eleanor, sitting at the head of the table, looked at me with a satisfied smile. Brian and Jessica were also there, completely unsuspecting. They thought I was playing my part as the dutiful daughter-in-law. I inserted my flash drive into the large screen TV set up in the living room. Calmly, I pressed play. The screen lit up. But instead of photos of the birthday girl, what appeared was an image of Brian and Jessica locked in an embrace on that very familiar sofa. The lively living room fell instantly silent. Everyone froze. Their eyes widened. In disbelief. I heard the clink of a fork dropping to the floor. Eleanor's mouth fell open, her face turning ashen. She stammered, demanding to know what it was. And for someone to turn it off immediately. Brian, as if struck by lightning, jumped up and ran towards the TV to pull the plug. But it was too late. The video continued. Filthy caresses, shameless kisses, and lewd moans echoed throughout the once dignified room. All the relatives were frozen. Whispers began to erupt. People couldn't believe their eyes, recognizing Brian and Jessica, brother-in-law and sister-in-law. It was an illicit, disgraceful affair. After the lurid scene, the bank transaction history appeared on the screen. The large sums of money, the expensive gifts, all listed in plain sight. The guests were shocked for a second time. Not only were they having an affair, but they were stealing money, deceiving a wife and a brother. The bomb had detonated. The Williamson family was plunged into chaos. Eleanor was frozen, unable to speak, just trembling all over. Brian and Jessica's faces were drained of all color. They stood frozen in the middle of the room, receiving hundreds of contemptuous and disgusted stares. I stood in the corner, silently observing the fruits of my labor. I felt no joy or satisfaction, just a strange emptiness. But I knew I had done the right thing. This rottenness had to be exposed. And then, the second lightning bolt struck. The real one. David, who had been sitting silently with reddened eyes and white-knuckled fists, suddenly leaped up. He said nothing. He just walked slowly towards his older brother, and then a heavy thud echoed through the room, starting a brawl between brothers in the st. middle of the party. The sound of David's punch landing squarely on Brian's face was a sickening crack that made everyone flinch. Brian staggered backward, falling onto the banquet table. The table overturned, sending plates and food crashing to the table floor. The festive atmosphere turned into a battlefield. Brian clutched his Tixion's face, blood pouring from his nose, but David gave him no time to recover. He pounced on him like a wounded tiger, grabbing his collar and roaring that he was his brother, and he dared to sleep with his wife in his own house. He screamed that he would kill him. David beat Brian with his fists, feet, and knees. He was no longer the kind, simple engineer. The betrayal from the two people closest to him had turned him into a wild beast. All the pent-up pain, all the suspicion from the past week, erupted into destructive rage. Brian, weaker, could only cover his head and beg for forgiveness. He pleaded that it was his fault, but that Jessica had seduced him. In his panic, he shamelessly blamed his lover. Hearing her name, Jessica, who was kneeling in a corner, flinched. She crawled towards David, hugging his legs and crying. She begged for David's forgiveness, claiming Brian had forced her, and she didn't want to do it. This time, she played the tragic victim, trying to shift the blame, to evoke a drop of pity. But David no longer believed anyone. He kicked her away, his eyes full of disgust. He told her to shut up, calling her a filthy woman no better than his brother. The brawl between the brothers intensified. The relatives, recovering from their shock, rushed to separate them. The men tried to pull David off, while the women helped Brian up. Screams, curses, and cries mingled into a chaotic, shameful symphony. The once proud Williamson home had turned into a circus. Eleanor sat in her chair like a statue. She didn't cry or scream. She just sat there, staring with a vacant expression as her two sons fought, as the party was destroyed. The family values and honor she so cherished were now being trampled by the very sons she adored. The mask of morality, the facade of a prosperous family she loved to boast about, had been mercilessly ripped apart by me, the daughter-in-law she despised most, in front of all their relatives. She couldn't say a single word to defend her favorite son. Any words now were meaningless. In this chaos, no one paid attention to me. I stood silently in the corner, calmly observing. I was the director of this play, and everything was going exactly as I had scripted. This physical punishment was for David, a way for him to release some of his pain. But for me, this wasn't enough. I needed a deeper punishment. One more disgusting truth had to be revealed to completely sever the 5 years last remaining emotional ties in this family. And it seemed heaven itself was on my side. In her panic, backed into a corner by David, Jessica, in a desperate attempt to save herself and find justification, shouted a sentence that unintentionally revealed an even more shocking truth. A truth that would plunge Eleanor into the abyss of despair. She screamed that it wasn't just her fault, that his mother knew too. She had known for a long time. Jessica's words were like a second bomb exploding in the eye of the storm. The room fell silent again. All the shocked, contemptuous gazes now turned to Eleanor, who sat motionless in her chair. Even David stopped, turning to his mother with a look of utter disbelief. The matriarch's complicity in this crime was about to be exposed by the very pawn she had been protecting. Everyone in the room held their breath, waiting for Eleanor's reaction. The air grew thick and tense. Shaken from her stupor, Eleanor began to tremble. She glared at Jessica with a look that was a mixture of fury at the betrayal and panic that her darkest secret was about to be revealed. She shrieked, calling Jessica a wretched girl, and asking what nonsense she was talking about, trying to deny it. But Jessica had nothing left to lose. Cornered, she was like a wounded animal ready to bite anyone, even her protector. She looked straight at Eleanor, her voice filled with venom and bitterness. She asked if Eleanor dared to say she didn't know. She brought up the Louis Vuitton bag she had given her last month, asking if she knew where the money came from. She mentioned the pearl necklace Eleanor was wearing now, asking who bought it. She revealed that it was all money Brian had given her. She had told Eleanor how good Brian was to her, and Eleanor had been pleased. She had even told Jessica to be smart and take good care of him. She challenged her to deny it. Every word from Jessica was a hammer blow to Eleanor. She froze, her face deathly pale, unable to deny it. The shocking truth was out. Eleanor, the matriarch who always preached about morals and family values, had known about the illicit relationship between her son and her younger daughter-in-law all along. But out of greed, for the expensive gifts Jessica gave her from Brian's money, she chose to turn a blind eye. She allowed the sin to happen, allowed her elder daughter-in-law, me, to be deceived and betrayed in her own house. She had even secretly encouraged the relationship because it brought her material gain. Hearing this, David froze. He looked at his mother, then at his wife. There was no more anger on his face, only boundless pain and disappointment. The mother he had always respected, the wife he loved, both had deceived him, conspiring to hide a monstrous sin. His trust was completely shattered. He said nothing, just took a few steps back, looking at them as if they were strangers. I stood and watched all of this. Now I understood. I understood why Eleanor had despised me and doted on Jessica. Because I was just a useless daughter-in-law who could work but brought her no material benefit. Whereas Jessica was a gold mine, a hen that laid golden eggs, and it didn't matter that those eggs were born of rot and immorality. A mother's love, a mother-in-law's relationship, in her eyes, it was all measured in money. Boundless contempt filled my soul. Any last shred of feeling I had tried to hold on to for this woman vanished at that moment. She didn't deserve to be called a mother. She was just a greedy, selfish, and wicked old woman. The relatives who had once respected Eleanor now looked at her with entirely different eyes. They whispered among themselves, shocked that she would sell her family's honor for money, understanding now why she had so fiercely defended her son and youngest daughter-in-law. Exposed in front of all her kin, Eleanor could not take it anymore. She clutched her chest, her breathing becoming ragged. She whispered for water, but no one moved. Everyone just stood and stared at her with cold, indifferent eyes. Even Brian, her precious son, was too consumed by his own shame to notice his mother. I watched this scene without a drop of pity. This was the price she had to pay. You reap what you sow. She had sown greed and lies, and now she was reaping humiliation and loneliness. The show was almost over. All the secrets were out. It was time for me to take back what was mine. I calmly walked to the center of the room, where all attention was focused. I walked straight to Brian, who was sitting pathetically on the floor. I silently pulled a stack of papers from my bag and threw them in his face. I told him in a voice as cold as ice to sign them, that it was over between us. It was the divorce petition I had already prepared, the opening shot of my legal assault. The divorce papers landed in front of Brian like a death sentence. He tremblingly picked them up, saw the bold letters, and looked at me with fear and disbelief. Perhaps until that moment, he still held the illusion that out of Teramat love for him, out of fear of public opinion, I would choose to remain silent and endure. He had grossly underestimated the hatred and determination of a woman pushed to the edge. He stammered my name, trying to crawl and grab my leg. He admitted he was wrong and begged for another chance to start over. A chance. I gave a bitter, ironic smile. I asked if he gave me a chance when he was cold to me. Did he give me a chance to know why when he was secretly sleeping with his brother's wife? Did he give me a chance to be respected when he spent my hard-earned money to finance her? He had closed all the doors, and now I was going to lock them and throw away the key. I didn't give him a chance to say anything else. I turned to the relatives and said in a clear, firm voice that I was sorry to have disturbed them on this special day, but there was a cancer that, if not removed, would destroy the Rito entire body. I, Clara, officially declared today that I was no longer a daughter-in-law of the Williamson family. After saying that, I turned and walked away, ignoring Brian's cries and pleas, Eleanor's vacant stare, and the chaos behind me. I knew my war wasn't over. It had just moved from the emotional battlefield to the legal one. And on that field, I had all my weapons prepared. The next day, my lawyer and I were at the courthouse. I didn't just file for a unilateral divorce. I filed a petition to freeze all joint assets registered under Brian's name, including our house, cars, and bank accounts. I wouldn't give him a chance to hide anything before the trial. Then, I filed a lawsuit against Brian for adultery and embezzlement of marital assets, with irrefutable evidence in my hands. The video of the affair, detailed bank transaction histories, and the business plan for his mistress's boutique. My lawyer said victory was 100% mine. I wasn't just demanding a larger share of the assets. I demanded compensation for the emotional distress I had suffered. Receiving the summons from the court, Brian was completely broken. He never expected me to act so decisively and mercilessly. He called and messaged me constantly, sometimes begging, sometimes threatening, but I never answered. To me, he was already a stranger. Eleanor, learning of this, also tried to save her son. She called me, alternating between a soft and a cynical tone, asking if I wasn't being too cruel. She reminded me he was my husband, the future father of my children, and asked what I would gain by cornering him. I calmly replied over the phone that first, we had no children. Second, he had cornered himself long before I did anything. And third, she should just take care of her own health and stay out of it. Otherwise, I couldn't guarantee that the secret of her complicity wouldn't become public knowledge. Hearing that, Eleanor fell silent. The trial was swift. Faced with undeniable evidence, Brian couldn't deny anything. He stood before the judge looking haggard and pathetic, a far cry from the elegant director of sales he once was. He bowed his head and admitted all his sins, hoping only for mercy. Finally, the court issued its verdict. I was granted the divorce. The house and cars were appraised, and I was awarded 2/3 of their value because the second daedalus fault was entirely Brian's. He had to sell the house to pay me my share. All the money, nearly $80,000 he had secretly taken, had to be returned to me in full. In addition, there was a significant compensation for emotional damages. After the trial, Brian had nothing. He had not only lost his wife, family, and reputation, but he was also saddled with massive debt. He knelt on the courthouse steps, crying and clutching the hem of my dress. But I just coldly brushed his hand away and left. The door of hope was closed to him. Forever. Epilogue. Just deserts. After my decisive victory in court, the real storm hit the other members of the Scred Williamson family. They were like parasites. When the host they lived on died, they perished with it. The first to be punished was Jessica. After the birthday party, David quietly packed his things and left. He didn't file for divorce immediately. Not because he missed her, but because he wanted his wife to feel what it was like to live a life worse than death. He cut off all contact and blocked all their joint accounts. Jessica, accustomed to a life of luxury, suddenly lost her source of income. With no job and no money, she became a true parasite in that crumbling house. When Brian had to sell the house to pay off his debt to me, Jessica panicked. She realized the day she would be thrown out onto the street was near. She tried to contact David, crying and begging, but was met with a terrifying silence. David was giving her time to feel despair for herself, to understand what hell was. And on the day the house was sold, David appeared. He didn't come alone, but with a lawyer. He didn't say a word to Jessica, just handed her the signed divorce papers. In the petition, he demanded that she leave with nothing, as she had committed adultery and violated the marital contract. Jessica screamed and begged, but David just coldly pushed her away. His last words to his unfaithful wife were that she deserved nothing from him and to get out of his life. Jessica was kicked out of the house that night with just one suitcase. With a reputation as an adulteress who slept with her brother-in-law, she became the laughingstock of the neighborhood. She went to her parents' house, but they, having learned of their daughter's shameful actions, closed the door on her. They couldn't accept a child who had tarnished the family name. Rejected by her husband's family, disowned by her parents, Jessica became homeless. With no money, no meaningful education, and only her fading beauty, she began a life of drifting, doing odd jobs to survive. Her future was bleak, without a single ray of light. Brian's life was even worse. The incest scandal at the birthday party had been recorded by a relative and uploaded to social media. Although the video was quickly taken down, it was enough to destroy his career. The company he worked for didn't want to be associated with an employee's bad reputation, and fired him. After selling the house and paying off all his debts to me, he was left with very little money. He was forced to rent a cramped, moldy room in a rough part of town. From a respected director of sales driving a luxury car and living in a magnificent house, he turned into an unemployed man hiding from contemptuous stares. Relatives considered him a family disgrace. No one offered him a helping hand. He had to take up manual labor to survive. He lived every day with guilt and belated regret. His life had hit rock bottom, a bottom he had dug for himself. While the main sinners, Brian and Jessica, paid for their deeds, the accomplice who enabled the sin did not escape fate's punishment either. Eleanor, after the sin/brought proclaimed ADS, severe shock of the birthday party and the humiliating trial, finally broke. The extreme stress triggered a massive stroke. Half of her body was paralyzed. Her face drooped, and her speech became slurred. From a powerful, sharp-tongued woman, she turned into a disabled person confined to a bed, completely dependent on others. When the house was sold, Brian, also living in poverty, had neither foreseen the energy nor the money to care for his mother. He was forced to place her in a cheap, state-run nursing home on the outskirts of the city with horrifying conditions. David, her other son, was completely cold towards his mother. He considered her one of the main causes of their family's tragedy. He never visited her once. He told relatives his mother was dead to him. Eleanor lay in a cold bed in the nursing home, alone. Surrounded by elderly strangers, there was not a single relative by her side. The last days of her life were spent in the agony of illness and regret. She remembered her glory days, her pride in her family, her 2 successful sons. But it had all shattered. Like a soap bubble. In her delirium, she kept calling my name, Clara. Perhaps only now did she realize that the daughter-in-law she had hated and despised was the only one who had truly treated her with decency. She regretted it, she cried, but it was too late. Tears of remorse could not wash away her sins, could not save a family that had rotted from within. The door of hope and forgiveness was closed to her forever. The punishment of conscience was perhaps the most painful and cruel torment of all. I heard this news from distant relatives, and my heart remained calm. There was no joy, no pity. I just thought that the law of karma is always fair, even if it comes late. Each of them got the end they deserved. And I, having completed my mission as judge, had to move on with my own life. After settling all the divorce matters and securing my assets, I felt reborn. I was no longer Clara Williamson, the obedient and humiliated shadow. I was Clara, a free, independent woman who could determine her own destiny. I sold the old house filled with bitter memories. With that money and my settlement, I bought a spacious apartment in a nice part of the city. I brought my parents to live with me. After years of worrying about me, they deserved a peaceful and happy retirement. My job as an accountant at my old firm no longer satisfied me. I resigned and decided to pursue my dream. With my knowledge of finance and my experience, I, along with a few friends, founded a small consulting firm that helps small and medium-sized businesses. It was difficult at first, but thanks to persistence and determination, my company slowly grew and began to thrive. I found joy and passion in my work, something that had been lost for a long time. I no longer lived for others. I lived for myself. I didn't rush into a new relationship. The scars of betrayal were still there and needed time to heal. But I was no longer afraid of love. I believe that somewhere out there is a good man who will appreciate and love me sincerely. But before finding him, I had to learn to love and value myself first. Occasionally, news of the Williamson family would reach me. Brian was still struggling at the bottom of society. Jessica had disappeared, no one knew where she went. And Eleanor reportedly died in the nursing home from a second stroke. All the grudges and hatred had now completely vanished like smoke. My story may be a tragedy, but it is also a lesson. A costly lesson about betrayal, greed, and the consequences of enabling sin. But more importantly, it is a lesson about the power of self-worth and a woman's will to live. We women can be weak, we can sacrifice, but we must never let others trample on our dignity. This afternoon, standing on the balcony of my apartment, looking out at the sovereign, bustling city traffic, I smiled. I used to be a bird in a cage, obedient and helpless. But now, I am a phoenix that has risen from the ashes of the past to spread its wings and soar into the vast, blue sky. The storm has passed, and before me awaits a bright dawn.